After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan, that's Saul's son, remember him, became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him, and did not let him return to his father's house. Now we had already seen Saul ask Jesse to let David stay with Saul as a flute player and armor bearer. We read about in the Goliath story how David would go back and forth between Saul and the battle lines and his father Jesse's house. So I guess now, so David, I guess, had some kind of a transition state where he was in Saul's court, but also would go back to his father's house from time to time. And now we're making it permanent that he's going to be with Saul. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people, and Saul's officers as well. So this is apparently going on for a while. This is not just one battle against one guy, Goliath, or just even that one fight. This is now becoming a recurring thing. David has become a successful military man. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, probably not Goliath, because this is probably some other battle with the Philistines. We just got done reading about how David this was not his career. He was now just a man in the military, a high-ranking officer in the military. The women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with tambourines and lutes. That's why guys do it. That's why they go to war, so they can come back, they can go home victorious and ride in parades and have all the women of the town singing their praises. That's why they do it. That's what makes it worth it. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul was but they don't do it so that someone else gets the credit. Men don't go to war so that the women, when they come home and are victorious, so that the women will sing someone else's praise. That's not why they do it. Now, these women, we don't know. These women may have been intending to credit Saul for David's success. This wouldn't have been a reach in the mind of the ancient person. They may have thought, it was very common that whenever someone won a battle in the name of the king got credit for winning that battle. Okay, that's actually standard. Later on, we're going to find all kinds of examples in both Israel and in the nations around them of the commanders or the messengers acting in the name of the king, and whatever they do while acting in the name of the king is credited to the king. Okay? Later on, when Israel is being attacked by Assyria, the Assyrian messenger is going to come and say, he's going to speak as the king, saying, "I'm going to come and do this." The messenger is not going to do it, but the king is. And the messenger is speaking with the authority of the king. Same thing when Nebuchadnezzar comes along, and Jeremiah is going back and forth trying to convince the king of Judah to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. They're going to do that. In fact, we, as representatives of God, Jesus the king, are the same way. Whatever we do in the name of the king is credited to the king. Okay? When we act in the name of the king, which we are supposed to do as Christians, that's supposed to be our calling, is that we belong to his kingdom. He is our king, and we act in his name. Whatever we do, whatever we say, wherever we go, wherever we live, we act in his name. And when we do that, what we do is credited in the name of the king. So it could very well be these women were not intending to slight King Saul with their song. Okay? They could very well be trying to credit King Saul for David's thousands, tens of thousands, because Saul picked David to be his king, his commander. And David is acting in the name and of the authority of Saul. So these tens of thousands could be credited to Saul. In fact, like I said, to the ancient mind, that would have been extremely common. That would have been the standard way of thinking of it. So I don't know at all if these women were intending to slight the king. I don't think they would have been. I don't think if you're a regular person, if you're, a woman in this, just a group of regular women going, I don't think you'd be actively trying to insult the king as he's riding through your towns victorious at her battle. It doesn't make any sense. So I don't think they meant it as an insult or a slight, and I don't even think they meant it to glorify David over Saul. But that's how Saul took it. That is how Saul took it. Because he wants those women to be singing his praises, and he thinks they're singing David's praises. They may not be. That may not be their intent, but that is how Saul is taking it. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They had credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more could he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Now, Saul's been told someone else is going to take his kingdom someday. He has not been told who. Maybe it's going to be this guy. This guy traveling behind him as he rides victorious through these cities. That might be the guy. I may have welcomed my own successor into my house. I don't know if I want that now, do I? The next day, an evil spirit, or an injurious spirit, from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house, while David was playing the harp as he usually did. David has no idea anything is wrong. Saul had a spear in his hand. Now we're going to see Saul holding the spear nearby all the time from this point forward. I think it's an insight into his paranoia at this point. Saul is going to be keeping the spear so close by that he's got it basically in his hand all the time. That's how fearful he is of an attack. He's always got this spear with him from now on. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. This is it. I'm going to get him. I'm going to eliminate this rival right here, right now. But David eluded him twice. My guess is that the first time David saw it coming, ducked out of the way, didn't know what was happening, tried to reason with Saul. Saul, I guess, may have calmed down slightly, went to go get the spear, and then threw it at him again, and then David got away. My guess is that that's what happened. David probably remained in the room after the first throw because he wasn't totally certain what was going on, probably. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. This is still going on. This is still taking time, by the way. And everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was, or he was very wise, wise he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah, again, the two things are listed separately here, loved David because he led them in their campaigns. So what is Saul going to do? He's created his own worst enemy here, hasn't he? He has invited his successor into his palace court, and soon he's going to invite him into his family. Saul said to David, he offered his daughter in marriage to the guy who killed Goliath, so he's got to honor that. So here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. I'll let the Philistines do that. I can't take action against this guy. The Lord is with him, and the people love him. If I take action against him, they're going to overthrow me. But I'll put him in situations where the Philistines will take care of him. David is going to end up doing this same thing to another guy later on, by the way. This idea of forcing a guy out into the front lines of battle so that he'll die in battle is a trick that David himself will play later on, successfully too. It won't work for Saul, but it will work for David. But David said to Saul, Who am I? And what is my family, or my father's clan in Israel, that I should become the king's son-in-law? So, when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage instead to Adriel of Meholah. So he didn't get the firstborn daughter of Saul, or the first daughter of Saul, but he will get another one. Now Saul's daughter, Michal, was in love with David. And when they she really liked him. I don't know if Merab did, but Michal did. She was in love with this guy. She was swooning over him. And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, as that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. So the first time David himself said no. Now again, he had offered his daughter in marriage to whoever could kill Goliath. So this was a known thing. This was a known reward. And David himself knew. He confirmed it twice. He confirmed it with one set of people and then another set of people. So he knew what the stakes were for him personally if he could defeat Goliath. But he deliberately chose not to take one part of those rewards, which was marrying the daughter of Saul. At least the first time. But Saul has another daughter, so he has another chance. And this daughter loves David. This daughter is, I'm guessing this daughter is swooning over David. David was a very handsome man. We've made that point clear several times now that David was a good-looking fellow. And we read about all the wonderful qualities he had. Okay? One of the Saul's servants in 1 Samuel 16 says, he knows how to play the harp, he's brave, he's a warrior, he speaks well, he's fine-looking, the Lord is with him. Okay, he has a litany of great qualities. So my guess, and we read, we saw the women come out and sing about him, okay? And we'll read all throughout his lifetime, and his son's lifetime too as well, Solomon after him. And the women were falling over themselves to get to this guy. He was a big hit with the ladies. It's going to be his biggest problem in life. It's going to be his son's biggest problem in life. So my guess is that Michal is probably a young woman. She's unmarried, so she's still pretty young. Was just swooning over David. Okay, I have a teenage niece right now who swoons over Harry Styles. Okay, I have never been a teenage girl. I was never a teenage girl. I was a teenage boy, but I was never a teen. I don't want to be a teenager, but I was never a teenage girl. And I don't have any daughters of my own, but I do have nieces. And one of my oldest nieces, who's a teenager, has spent the last year swooning over Harry Styles. And so I have now gotten a glimpse of what it is like when a teenage girl gets a crush on somebody, a fantasy on whoever, okay? I don't have a problem with it. I think it's a normal part of her development. It doesn't bother me. I'm not her parent either. I don't know what her parents think of it, but whatever, So I know what it's like now, as having observed it in my niece, about what it's like when a teenage girl. Now this girl, Michal, is probably older than my teenage niece is right now, but probably not a whole lot. Okay, she's probably not a whole lot older. I mean, an unmarried girl probably wouldn't be too terribly. I mean, they would want these girls got married early in life back in these days. Now, this is a princess. This is a daughter of the king, so Saul may have been more guarded in handing out his daughters than some fathers would be. But, it's like, when your daughter entered, fertility stage, when her body developed to the point where she could start having kids, you didn't want to wait very long, all right? So these girls would get married off pretty early. We would consider it in many cases today too early in life, but these girls are getting married off in life pretty early. So David himself is probably still a young man, only in his early 20s at this point. Now, some time is passing here. We don't get an account of how much time is passing. But some time is passing here as David is going out and doing all these things. David is probably now a young man in his 20s, past military age. I don't think he was when he fought Goliath, but he is clearly now, I think, now. So I don't know how old Michal is, but she's probably in her mid to late teens. I can't imagine she'd be much older than that because, again, these girls didn't wait that long to get married in this day and time. So this is probably just a teenage crush. David has all these wonderful qualities that make him a great leader of men and make him irresistible to women. And I think Michal is just in his thrall. I think Michal is just a teenage girl, 16, 17, maybe years old, who is just enraptured by David. Now this one's going to wear off. Okay, the spell will wear off, and Michal will come to dislike David later. They're not gonna stay enraptured with each other. I don't know if David really cared. Michal is not going to stay enraptured with David as she grows up through her adulthood. But right now, she is in the throes of passion for David. And Saul is going to take advantage of this because he wants David to be in his family so he can order him around and go have him fight battles in which he's likely to die. That's what Saul wants to do. Then Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king is pleased with you, and his attendants all like you. Now become his son-in-law.'" So as of now, Saul has not openly, and he threw the spear at him. David apparently forgave him for that. David knows that Saul is beset by an evil spirit, and so David likely just credited that outburst to the evil spirit influencing him. David has no ill will towards Saul at all, and Saul, except for that spear incident, has not yet publicly expressed his ill will towards David. They repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known," so he still doesn't want it. This is still something that he doesn't think he should have. When Saul, I don't know if David knows he's been appointed to be king. When that anointing happened, I'm not sure when David became aware that it was meant for him to become king someday. We didn't read that Samuel explicitly told him or Jesse or anybody what the anointing was for. I don't know when David becomes aware of this. Right now, he seems to still be having trouble with the idea of becoming the king's relative through marriage. That still seems to be causing him trouble. When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of Philistines. He's going to have to go in there and cut off the flesh of 100 dead Philistines. And hopefully, in the middle of the process of doing that, one of them will kill him and solve Saul's problem for him. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. Now he gets to do something. Now, again, he already did something in killing Goliath, because part of the conditions for winning the battle, the reward, was to have the king's daughter in marriage. We read about that in 1 Samuel 17. So he already basically did something to merit getting the king's daughter in marriage, but now he's getting, apparently he doesn't consider that to have been enough, but now he gets to do something else to prove his worth, so he's going to go out and do this, even though it's risky, because it means he has to fight 100 people. All it takes is one of them to get him. Of those 100 men he's out to kill and steal their skin, all it takes is one of them to aim his bow or his sword or his javelin the right way. So before the allotted time elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He's going to double the asking price. He was asked to bring 100, he's going to bring 200. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Saul may have thought that Michal, his daughter, would remain loyal to him, and he could use her as an agent against David in David's own house. Apparently that didn't work, at least not at first. Apparently Michal sided with David after marriage because she was so in love with him. So Saul cannot even rely on Michal now to help him fight David, which he apparently was thinking he'd be able to rely on her for that. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. Okay, so that's enough of that for today. We are introducing the David portions of Scripture. And I want to talk a little bit about David in general before we continue on with this any further. David, it's easy to remember that David lives and reigns right about the year 1000 BC. His actual dates would go from like 1110 BC to 970 BC or so, as calculated by Edwin Thiele, whom I've mentioned before. Figured out the links of the reigns of the Hebrew kings and mapped them to our calendar. So basically 1000 BC. So it's easy to just round it off and say that David lived about 1000 BC. This is before that. Okay, this is before he's becoming king. His 40-year reign as king would be from about 1110 to 970 BC. This is before that. So this is before 1110. I don't know exactly when, but sometime around 1120 or so BC, he has become king. Here he is not yet king, but he's around. So he 1020, not 1120, 1020 BC or 1030 BC. So he lives around 1000 BC. David is one of those characters in the scriptures that our modern day smart people have all kinds of problems with. They do not like David at all. They do not want to accept any of the stories about David as being accurate or correct. David to them is all just a myth. Basically, most people, even the smart people, generally accept that from the time the monarchy splits, and we have two kings, one in Israel, one in Judah, that point onward, the historical narrative of the Bible is accurate, reliable. Generally speaking, that's accepted. They have a hard time going back any farther than that, though. I mentioned that before. Of course, we talked about this when it comes to the Exodus, and of course the period of the Judges. But one of the hard things for these guys to accept, the smart people to accept, is David. Okay, the story of David, the kingship of David, and David is just too much for them. Now, David, there's a few things going on here. For one thing, David is just a little bit too far back in history. Okay, he lives about 1000 BC. You go just a little bit farther on to the days of his grandson, Rehoboam, basically, when the kingdom splits. Then you get into a lot more solid ground. But David himself is just a little bit too far back beyond the misty curtain that kind of obscures our view of ancient history. You don't have to go too much farther than him to come into a field where we've got a much plainer view and a much stronger sense of things. But David himself is a little bit too far back. He goes just a little bit too far back there for us to be totally certain of him. That's one thing. Another thing is that David is such an instrumental figure in the Old Testament and in Israel's history. And Jesus Christ's claim to the kingship comes from the promise that God makes to David later on. So, one great way, then, to deny that Jesus is the Christ is to say, well, David didn't exist. That's all just made up. Okay? So if we have a problem accepting that Jesus is king today over earth, one of the ways that we can get out of having to acknowledge Jesus as king is saying that, well, David was never king. You know, Jesus' entire claim to the kingship is based on a promise that God made to David. Well, we'll just say that David didn't exist, and therefore Jesus Christ has no claim to be king. Problem solved. Okay? That's part of it too. And you have to remember also that David is still existing as him, just a step beyond the misty veil of history. When he comes along, Israel is still not a completely organized, unified government. Saul begins that transition from the tribe, well, Samuel, I guess, does, in the sense that he's the last judge. Samuel anoints Saul. Saul becomes king and reigns for a period of time. And not certain exactly how long, but for a period of time. He begins the process of organizing Israel, these scattered independent tribes, into a nation. David then finishes it, and it really reaches its zenith under Solomon, David's son. And then immediately it splits. And so, we're still talking about a time when their records would have been very transitory. We have their record right here. And they'll mention in these documents, of these other documents that they use to put together this account, they're gone. Okay, I don't know what kind of palace Saul had, but whatever it was, it's not going to be as stable and permanent as later kings will be. They're still in this kind of transitory phase where they're going from this very loose, transient, impermanent tribal, confederacy to this more permanent, more rigid, more well-established, more well-founded monarchy. And David isn't quite there. During David's time, He secures Israel's borders and grants them peace. But he still kind of exists in that time when things weren't as permanent as they would be later on. But I'll also say this. This is December of 2021. About a year and a half ago, a great example came to me about how, part of the reason why we think David is a myth is simply because it seems like a myth, okay? When you read the story of David in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then restate it in 1st Chronicles, with a more priestly, temple-oriented focus. When you read the story of David, it sounds like a myth. It reads like a story, okay? In many cases, it seems too good to be true. He does seem to be too humble, too nice of a guy, too nice of a king. And he has his bad moments. He does. But it's like, it does seem like, well, he couldn't really be this. Like, this guy couldn't really exist. All these things, his rivalry with Saul. Like, I talked about David and Goliath, like the prototypical wrestling match. It's like, this stuff seems like a myth. It seems like a story that someone made up. It doesn't seem like it could have happened. It seems like it's too good to be true. So I think that's part of it too. It doesn't seem like it could be real. It doesn't seem like the story of King David could actually have happened. It seems like fiction and something somebody made up. But I'll tell you, I'm going to give you a real life example that has happened in our own day and time of a story that seems like it's too good to be true, and that really happened, and that it didn't take very long for people to forget that it really happened. Okay, this is December of 2021. About a year and a half ago, in the spring, I think it was May 2020, during the early days of COVID, ESPN had this series of, the sports network had this series of a series of installments called The Last Dance, and it was about Michael Jordan, the famous NBA player from the 80s and 90s. And it was ultimately about like his last year with the Chicago Bulls in 1997-98, the last season he spent with the Bulls, and the last time they won an NBA championship. That was kind of like his ultimate focus, but to get to there, they went through a recap of his entire career and the beginning of his life, even. So we go from his life growing up with his father and mother and family down in North Carolina, to his high school days, to his college days, to being drafted into the NBA in his Bulls days, and then of course his rise to fame. He would start even in high school and then through college, and then as an NBA player for the Chicago Bulls, and then winning the championship in 1991 for the first time, and all his. So they go through all of that. And they have a lot of people. Jordan himself is on this documentary. And they have a lot of other commentators in this documentary that speak, former teammates, former rivals, coaches, whatever, as well as a bunch of sports writers who covered him during his career, in the 80s and 90s, who are still alive and still active. They're older now, of course. Instead of being in their 40s and 50s, now they're in their 60s and 70s, but they're still alive. They still remember. And, and in the process of going through this documentary, and I remember that too, like I was alive for that. Now, I wasn't alive, I don't remember Jordan's college days, okay? Jordan's college days were in the early to mid-80s, and I was too young for that. But I remember his pro career. I remember him as early as when he won the slam dunk contest, which I think was in '88. And he was in Chicago. I live in Illinois, so we don't have a St. Louis. We don't have an NBA team in St. Louis. St. Louis is the metropolitan area that I live closest to. So we don't have an NBA team in St. Louis. So our loyalties for the NBA, as far as NBA goes, were with Chicago growing up. So the Bulls, and Jordan was a Bull. So I knew all about him. We had WGN in our house. We watched all of his games. So I saw all of that happen. I eventually began to dislike the Bulls. After their first run of 3 titles, 91-93, and he went away and came back, I was an enemy of the Bulls. I did not like the Bulls. I rooted against them. I couldn't stand them in the mid-90s. But I remember them as far back as the early days of the Bulls dynasty. I remember Jordan. I was a kid, though, okay. But what was really interesting to me in May of 2020, watching the world process this Michael Jordan documentary, This was in the era of COVID. This was May of 2020 when we still were mostly under lockdown. People said this was before George Floyd, the protests that erupted after that. This is like right before that, like 2 weeks before that. And so we really didn't have anything to do but sit around and watch Michael Jordan documentaries. You know, the NBA itself had shut down at that time. You know, they shut down in March. Their season didn't start again until later on. Baseball didn't start until later that season. Like, there was nothing going on. Okay, we had this phase in the spring of 2020 where there was nothing going on. So the world just watched Michael Jordan documentary. And we all like remembered again that Michael Jordan really happened. Like, all this stuff really happened. Like, this Michael Jordan myth is not a myth. It really happened. Okay? It wasn't fiction. It wasn't made up. Now, it seems too good to be true. You know, one of the reasons why I didn't like Michael Jordan in the later days, in the mid-90s, is because he just annoyed me. Like, it seemed like this was just not real. You know, it seemed like this shouldn't be happening. It seemed like this team should not exist. You know, and I think that over the years since Jordan, since he retired, you know, the Bulls disbanded in '98. Jordan retired for good in '03. And since then, no one has come along to recapture that magic, to recapture that mythic feeling. They've tried to do it a few times with Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, and even Dwayne Wade for a while. But no one has ever really, like, recaptured that. No one has ever really been able to successfully put that lightning back in a bottle again and make it feel like the story come to life again, like Michael Jordan did. That was a one-time only thing. I mean, that was, you know, like, that's not ever going to happen. You can't recreate that. But it did happen. Like, that story did happen. And we had forgotten. You know, and one of the things that was interesting is watching some of these older sports writers who were active in covering him at the time. They were not only alive, they were not only adults and old enough to remember, they were even active in covering his career at the time. And they had forgotten. You know, they had forgotten just how incredible this was at the time. You know? And so we have an example, even in our own history, our own recent past, my lifetime, okay, of something happening that just seems like impossible to be happening. Like, just this story come to life that couldn't really be happening, but yet it did. And it didn't take very long after it ended, after the story closed and everything, you know, and it all went away. It didn't take very long after that for people to just kind of rewrite their brains and think, well, it didn't really happen. It really wasn't like I remember it. It really wasn't that way. Okay? You know, this documentary came out in 2020. The Bulls won their first title fewer than 30 years before that, 1991. That was just a 30-year difference, and they won their last title in 98. Jordan retired in 03. He went to the Hall of Fame in 08. So the time between when he went to the Hall of Fame and when this documentary came out, it was only 12 years. That's not a very long time at all. Okay? And yet during that time, we just forgot that this myth really happened. It didn't seem to us like it could have. It wasn't working for LeBron. It wasn't working for Kobe. It wasn't working for Dwayne Wade. It wasn't working for any of the others. You know, any of the others who came along. Those are just some of the ones who were more successful in the long run. There were a lot of others that were not even, you know, that came along and didn't even go anywhere. And it's like, it seemed we had convinced ourselves that the Michael Jordan story didn't really happen the way we remember it happening because it didn't seem like it could have. And yet it did. And so I have that, you know, that example to me shows how easily we can just take these things that really happen and think to ourselves, that couldn't have happened. That just could not have happened that way. Because we've done it to ourselves with an example in our own lives in real time in the last 20, 30 years. So if it can happen in the span of 20 years, it can happen easily in the span of 3,000 years. Going from the year 2000 AD back to the year 1000 BC, okay? That's a lot more span of time than going from 2020 back to 1998 or 2008 or 1991 or whatever, however you want to judge it, okay? And we can do it in as short a time as this. We can certainly do it in as long a time as that, okay? So let's not try. So even though, yes, it seems like a story, it seems like a myth, it seems like it couldn't really have happened. But let's not dismiss it just for that reason alone, because we're outsmarting ourselves if we do that. I like to make fun of these smart people who think they're so smart. It's like, this is easily a case where we can outsmart ourselves. We outsmart ourselves in thinking that Michael Jordan's story didn't really happen, but it did. And we can easily outsmart ourselves in thinking that King David's story couldn't have happened because it just seems too ridiculous, and yet it did. That is not a reason to dismiss the story of King David because you just think it couldn't have happened.